We provided tables so that you could take notes. It might be easy, but unfortunately that also means that a few of you have your backs turned and will have to turn around. So here we go. We all settled? Great. It is my distinct pleasure as Dean of Global Education to welcome Leonard Ndiaye here to the Bedford campus. Leonard Ndiaye is our external evaluator for a Fulbright Hays grant that we have to Cambodia this year, and he teaches at the University of Manoa in Hawaii. Leonard Ndiaye is a professor of Southeast Asian history there, and his concentration is on Southeast Asia, particularly Malaysia, Indonesia, southern Philippines, and southern Thailand. He got his BA from Yale University, his MA and PhD in Southeast Asian history from Cornell, and he has taught at a variety of universities worldwide. Some of his publications include Leaves of the Same Tree, Trade and Ethnicity in the Straits of Malacca, and the recent Cambridge History of Early Modern Southeast Asia with Barbara Watson Ndiaye, who will be speaking to us at 12:30. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Leonard Ndiaye today. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. That's all right. Well, thank you very much, Donna, and thank you all for making it here to the lecture. I'm sure many of you wouldn't have come otherwise, had not pressure been put on you, but I'm glad you're here, and I am a bit of a missionary in a sense. I try to talk about Southeast Asia, try to interest students in Southeast Asia. And I thought that for this lecture, what I would do is to talk about Southeast Asian Islam, mainly because most people know about what is happening in the Middle East, and they focus on the radical elements that are there in the Middle East, and they forget that the vast majority of Muslims do not live in the Middle East. And so I'll tell you what I'm going to be talking about, and then I'll try to gradually bring you into the lecture itself. So the points that I'm making here are, first of all, that to understand Southeast Asian Islam, and I'm sure many of you don't even know where Southeast Asia is, but I'll show you in a minute, one has to distinguish between those countries that have a majority population in a Muslim population and those who don't. And you'll see in a minute how few countries actually have a majority population, only 3 in 11 countries in Southeast Asia. And the major points that I'm making here, in the nature of the lecture being only 45 minutes, I'll try to cover these clearly, but not in great detail. One of the reasons that contributes to the moderate aspect of Islam in Southeast Asia is, first of all, the nature of the Islamization process. How was Islam accepted in the Southeast Asian environment, particularly in 2 of the most important Muslim ethnic groups, and secondly, the role of the governments, Indonesian as well as the Malaysian governments, in pushing for moderate Islam. And at this stage, they're trying to tell the rest of the world and the Islamic world that one can use their patterns of Islam for other parts of the world. So just to put you into the picture, when you look at Islam, Islam is the second largest religion in the world next to Christianity. So there are, as I point out here, 1.2 billion Muslims. But what is interesting, even though the homeland of Islam is in the Middle East, only 20% of Muslims live in the Middle East. The vast majority, about 60% of the Muslims live in Asia. And the largest Muslim population in the world is Indonesia, in Southeast Asia. And then you get Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. These areas just add to the numbers of Asian Muslims. And so you have to understand that that everything that's happening in the Middle East is not necessarily happening throughout the Muslim world. And just for those of you who know something about Islam, there is a vast difference between the Sunni and Shia. They are approximately, depending on what statistics you use, 87 to 90% are Sunni. And those are the dominant Muslim populations. And the smaller denomination is Shia, between 10 and 13. And you can see the area of Shia is very concentrated where Iran, or Persia used to be, Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq, and some of the other places in Central Asia or that area, Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, and so forth. But they're very small compared to the other areas of the world, including Southeast Asia, which is predominantly, very vastly, Sunni. Now this is Southeast Asia. So just to get yourself acquainted, of course you all know China. Here's China, this side is India. And so Southeast Asia lies between China and India. So all of these countries here are Southeast Asia. There are 11 countries in Southeast Asia. 3 of them are minor, mini countries, such as Singapore here, right at the tip of the Malay Peninsula, Brunei here, and the third is East Timor, this eastern part of this island. So there are 3 mini states and 8 major states. Now here is to just give you an indication of the number of Muslims compared to the rest of the population. And if you look at this, the total number is about 235 million in total. But of the 235 million, most of them are from Indonesia. So Indonesia has over 240, almost 250 million. This is a little bit low in estimate. And that makes Indonesia the 4th largest country in the world by population. And of the 240 million or 250 million, 90% are Muslim. But if you look through this, the percentage of Muslims, you'll see that there are only 3 areas, 3 countries with Muslim majorities. The first, of course, is Indonesia by far. Malaysia is the 2nd largest Muslim majority, but it's only 58% because you have a large Chinese and Indian population. And the third is Brunei with 67%, but you can see it's only 388,000 people. And I have focused really on Malaysia and Indonesia because Brunei is run by an authoritarian monarch who runs everything, including the university. Even promotions have to be signed by the Sultan. So, you know, it's one of those countries that doesn't represent anything at all. It's just very unusual. Whereas the rest of the areas have very, very small populations of Muslims. And some of you are going to Cambodia, you can see here, it's only 1.6% of a population of nearly 50 million. So the Muslims in the other parts of Southeast Asia do not make much of an impression. However, there are areas where the Muslim minority have been fighting against the majority, and that's why they've come into the news, such as in southern Thailand. There are 7.3 million Muslim, mainly in the south, and in the Philippines, you have only 5% Muslim, and again, they are in the south. So if you look at here, this is the area where the Muslims are. They're mainly Malay who were formerly part of, or they still are part of the Malay world, but now are under Thailand. And the southern Philippines retained their independence from the Spaniards until the Americans took them over in the beginning of or late 1899 and 1905 and so forth. So this area continues to have a Muslim majority. And so when I emphasize you've got to realize the difference between a minority and majority country. In a minority countries, Muslim countries, they are fighting for recognition of Islam, of their ethnic identity, and therefore Islam has a very different tinge from those who come from Indonesia and Malaysia, where they're a majority and they can make policy. And they can then follow Islamic prescriptions without any problems, whereas the others have to fight for it. And this makes a difference in their attitudes toward Islam. And so one of the points I'm making is the nature of Islamic expansion. Indonesian scholars, intellectuals, Muslim intellectuals, have always argued that you cannot talk about Islam as if it were a monolithic belief system. that instead one could talk about Islams or different varieties of Islam. And if you look at this, this is only up to the middle of the 8th century. This is the area that Islam expanded. So Islam began really in the Hijaz, in the Saudi Arabia along the Red Sea, and Islam started about 622, but it quickly spread. So all of these areas show the spread. And by 1500, of course, Islam had spread throughout this whole region. Now, one of the things that scholars have pointed out, which is very interesting, is that in the expansion, when Islam moved into an area, they tended to move into areas that were of more older civilizations than themselves, because Islam was a tribal religion. It was a religion of the Arabs. But when they moved northward and conquered, for example, the Persian Empire, it was a very old Zoroastrian empire, very rich traditions. And so they absorbed some of the ideas from Persia. For example, the whole idea of somewhat of a divinity of the ruler. Some of these elements came from Persia. And when they conquered, much later on, the Byzantine Empire, they absorbed also the manner in the way in which, say, the bureaucracy was run, and so forth and so on. And in every step of the expansion into Asia as well, you had a different part of Islam being emphasized. While the tenets themselves, the basic ideas of Islam were preserved, some of the practices and some of the much less important elements of Islam were retained, particularly customary laws or customary practices. So let's look at the nature of the Islamization process in Southeast Asia. So if you remember that whenever Islam spread to another area, it brought these ideas, the basic tenets of Islam, but the local areas tended to make Islam their own. And so this is exactly what happened in Southeast Asia. And within Southeast Asia, we talk about it in terms of localization. And what it means is that an idea comes from the outside, and what happens is that these ideas are absorbed, but they're adapted. So things that are that are conflicting with the basic ideas within the region tend to be modified to make it more acceptable. Nevertheless, they saw the value of Islam and accepted it. And this process of accepting outside ideas, adapting them, and making them part of the indigenous belief is a very old process. And it happened even prior to the coming of Islam. Islam was very late to Southeast Asia. Prior to the coming of Islam, Hindu Buddhist ideas from India had already come in. And all of these ideas had been localized. And so when Islam arrived by the end of the 13th century, they had to accommodate, the religion had to accommodate itself to what was there, which was indigenous ideas, Hindu Buddhist ideas, and now Islamic ideas. And one of the factors which helped Islam becoming more acceptable to the population was Sufism. Now, Sufism of the South is a kind of a mystical element of Islam. And one of the things that characterized Sufism was the openness to different ideas, cultural ideas. And so it is believed that the ability of Islam through Sufism to accept some of the indigenous religious practices enabled Islam to become part of the spirit belief system in the area. And one of the ways in which, one of the reasons why this was so, was because in almost all the stories, the conversion narratives of the area of Southeast Asia, the stories talk of the Sufi saints. These are the Sufi scholars who came, and that it was the ability of these Sufi saints to demonstrate their superiority in contest with the native priests, which convinced people to adopt Islam. And one of the stories that I love to tell is one where the Sufi saints came into an area, and to demonstrate, and this one shows that this area never accepted Islam until later. The reason is in this story that comes from this area. The Sufi saints demonstrated their spiritual superiority by one of them sitting under the banana leaf. And those of you who know banana leaves, it is very hard for anybody to sit on a banana leaf because it sags. But this Sufi saint sat on top of the banana leaf. Now the local saint then went to the banana leaf and sat upside down without falling. And in the second contest, the Sufi saints piled a pile of eggs in this perfect mound without dropping a single one. Whereas the local priest went and took the middle egg and took it out without dropping a single egg. So because the local saints demonstrated their superiority, the people rejected Islam. Whereas if the other stories you look at, there's the Sufi saint who amazed people, like taking their ship. So there was a ship coming into the harbor, and it didn't stop at the harbor. It kept on sailing across the land. And people then realized that these are people with superior spiritual powers. Now in Southeast Asia, what attracted people was the fact that if you had superior spiritual powers, you could protect the family or your people, and you could bring prosperity. And so they didn't reject what they had before, they just added it on. And this is the reason you find in many of these belief systems a number of different ideas from different philosophies. It was only with the coming of Islam and later on of Christianity where these are Muslims from the 19th century and later, when it became very difficult to maintain indigenous ideas with religion because either you're a Muslim or you're not a Muslim. And in Christianity, either you're a Christian or not. But for a very long time, and even despite this kind of restriction by these religions, people continue to practice the indigenous ideas, belief. So the first area to convert to Islam in Southeast Asia was right here in the northern part of Sumatra, which is here, this area. And it was interesting that it was Marco Polo on his way back from China who stopped here and noted a community of Muslims. There were always Muslims floating around, traders and so forth, but not an entire community. And the reason why it was here is because the traffic between the West and the East went through the Straits of Malacca right here in the trade between China and East Asia with India, the Middle East, and Europe. And this was the only opening that they knew through the Southeast Asian region. And so it was no accident that Marco Polo landed here before his long journey to India, and he noticed a Muslim population. So in Southeast Asia, we say that Islam really began in the late 13th century, although you did have Islam evident in many other parts during that time, but not as entire communities. And so why did people embrace Islam? As I pointed out, the major reason was protection and prosperity, and also the ability of these Sufi missionaries to demonstrate the spiritual power of Islam. But other attractions was trade. Now in this period between the 16th and 18th century, there were 4 major civilizations in the world. One was Ming China, and the other 3 were Muslim kingdoms, the Ottoman Empire in Turkey, the Safavid Empire within the Persian area, and the Mughal Empire in India. So here you can see they overlap. Here is the Ottoman Turkish Empire. This is the Safavid Empire and the Mughal Empire. So there were major civilizations. When the Europeans went there, the Portuguese in the 15th century, they gave gifts, and they were so used to giving gifts in the New World where they're giving trinkets and so forth and so on. And they gave these things to these powerful rulers like the Mughal empires, and they thought it was very funny that the people from this primitive area of Europe providing these small trinkets, whereas these sultanates were vast empires with untold riches, wonderful civilizations. And so the point here is that Islam was attractive. And so you can see that Islam was adopted in Southeast Asia. And so what I wanted to show you today is two areas, the two major ethnic communities in Southeast Asia that are Muslim, to show how they accepted Islam and why this then provided the basis for a moderate form of Islam in Southeast Asia. So Java then is this island here. It's a tiny island, but it's a very, very rich area because it has very fertile lands, volcanic lands. It has moderate rainfalls, not the heavy monsoon rains that you find elsewhere, and has abundant sunshine. And so they were able to produce a lot of food, and with the production of food, you had a larger population. Much greater civilizations were able to arise as a result of surplus labor. So when you look at Java, it is starting when you consider that that small little island has 100 million people. So it's a little bit less than half of the population of Indonesia. And it's much larger than most countries in the world. So there are 100 million people living on that island, and the vast majority are Muslim. So they are the ethnic group that is dominant within Indonesia. Almost all the presidents except one have been a Javanese, and the Javanese control much of the bureaucracy, the educational system, etc. So they're important. So what is important then is to realize that the Javanese had an important say in the kind of Islam which eventually developed in Indonesia. So in their Javanese imaginary, in their traditions, they talk always of this Wali Songo, the 9 Sufi saints, who use not actual arms, but spiritual force to overcome the most powerful kingdom at that time, a Hindu Buddhist kingdom called Majapahit. And so what they said is that when they attacked, the enemy shot bullets, and the bullets were transformed into bees, who then attacked the enemy. The winds and the elements also came and destroyed the enemy. So here again, in the popular imagination, it's the spiritual powers of Islam which were important in the Islamization. But what is important as well is that when you look at the stories, and there are lots of oral stories among the ordinary people of each of these 9 Wali saints, Sufi saints, that all of their stories have stories of tolerance toward different kinds of beliefs. So while they are Muslims, they tolerate also the indigenous beliefs that were there before Islam. So they were doing that even when they were saying, we cannot accept the idea of different kinds of spirits within Islam, but they did tolerate Javanese beliefs in their spirits of natural spirits and so forth. And what is the interesting thing also that in the process of Islamization, Arabic, of course, came in. And so when you had to teach the Quran, the holy book of Islam, you had to be able to explain these things. But it is interesting that the Javanese did not translate, for example, the word for God. In the Philippines, the Spaniards used Dios, the word for God, because they didn't want to use the indigenous term, which might make people recall their own God. In Javanese, they retained Pangeran for God. And they also maintained ideas like Sambayan for the ritual prayer, Tapa for asceticism, and so forth. All of these things, a name for heaven, a name for the innermost soul, elements that were very important to Javanese culture, these were retained. And this is the reason Islam didn't totally transform the way that people thought about the religion. They were thinking of the religion also in terms of their own Javanese cultural ideas because of their decision not to translate many of the important Arabic terms of Islam into Javanese. And so there was always a very clear distinction between what was Javanese and what was Islam. And this then was a period of transition from the 14th to the 18th century, where one scholar talks about the mystic synthesis, where you had the very strong traditional Javanese ideas coinciding and working together very much with Islam. Now there was a change in the 19th century. Indonesia had been under the Dutch colonial power from the 19th century. And when the Dutch introduced their colonial bureaucracy, they always saw Islam as a danger. And so they emphasized the Javanese past, which is a very glorious past of large kingdoms, large beautiful monuments, very similar to the Angkorian ones that I talked about on Thursday last time, on Friday. And so the archaeological service of the Dutch colonial regime began a process of excavating. And they excavated and reconstructed large number of monuments. The most well-known, of course, is the Borobudur, which is a 9th century Mahayana Buddhist monument. And so they brought back many of these monuments which were pre-Islamic and gave prestige to these monuments, therefore strengthening the Javanese aspects of the religious ideas. And so many of the courts supported this idea, and you will find also that some of the writings of the 19th century, Javanese writings of the 19th century, also emphasize the importance of the pre-Islamic past. And so this emphasis on Javanese culture continued to foster more tolerance of different kinds of ideas and different kinds of Islam. And so the reformist movement, the Islamic reformist movement, which was taking place in the Middle East and also in India in the late 19th, early 20th century, did not make as great an impression in Java as they had in other parts of the Islamic world. And so you had a real Javanese challenge to Islam in the 19th century, also into the 20th century, because the Javanese courts, which are very powerful, had scholars who started to write. This is written in Javanese. They wrote treatises mocking Islam, and also to show the superiority of Javanese culture vis-a-vis Islam. And the strong ties between the court and the rulers and the ordinary Javanese people were reinforced by the emphasis on Javanese culture. And so while the ordinary people were nominal, they called them nominal Muslims, they considered themselves Muslim but were not very strict practitioners of the religion, they were seen to be fine, that they could be Javanese as well as be Muslim without causing any difficulties. And so what you have then is within the intellectual community of the Javanese, you had a combination of Western modernity. Remember, this is the late 19th, early 20th century. So all the modern ideas coming from the West, Western modernity, were being absorbed by the Western educated intellectuals from Java. And they were also looking at Islam not simply coming from the Middle East, but also Islam as interpreted by the West. And so you get a very curious development of Islamic scholarship where people are using Islamic ideas as well as Western ideas in molding Islam in a much more Javanese way. And so this then is one of the reasons why the more radical elements of Islam, ideas of Islam, never really penetrated very far in Java. Now I want to turn to the second important area, and this is the Malay world. The Malay world You can talk about Malaysia. Now this is Malaysia here, the green. It's an unusual country because it's separated by the South China Sea. But the Malay world includes also a large number of Malays who live along the east coast of Sumatra and who live along the southwest Borneo area. And here, this is the Malay Peninsula, and here is the Borneo area where many of the Malays also come from, and also in the South China Sea. So it's a fairly divided population in 3 or 4 different countries, but they are very important in the Islamization process. And so if you look at the conversion tales, you'll find that they have a kind of a structure. The ruler encounters the Prophet Muhammad in a dream. And in a dream, he miraculously learns Arabic, even though no one has ever taught him, so he's able to recite the profession of faith, the Shahada, in Arabic. And when he gets up, he discovers that he is circumcised. So that is in itself a major miracle. And the following day, a ship arrives with a Muslim missionary who converts the ruler. And in time then, his people also convert. And as in Java, the supernatural elements is what is emphasized in the conversion of the Malays. And there is, again, because of the Sufi element, greater tolerance of indigenous ideas. Now, in here, you have a localization as well, but you have a very interesting cross-fertilization between the courts and the villages. The Malays also had sultans or rulers and the villages. So the courts were a written tradition. And so they did receive texts, Arabic and Persian texts, into the courts, which were then translated into Malay. And so they were much more aware of what was happening in the wider Islamic world. Whereas the villagers were mostly an oral community. And so they were the ones who were really the repositories of indigenous ideas of spirits and their understanding of Islam. And so some of their understanding of Islam was not as clear as the ones that were in the written text. But it was a movement backward and forward so that even the ordinary people's beliefs were being brought into the courts. And so you get this cross-fertilization of ideas between the oral and written versions of this area. Now in Malay areas, a very strong element of ships coming in to bring the Muslim missionaries, Sufi missionaries here. And you get here this wonderful thing from the British Museum of a boat and a typical way in which these artists, because they cannot depict the human figure in any form, they tended to learn how to use the verses of the Quran in order to create pictures. And so here you see this is the verse that is used, and this is the Islamic text that is used here in a very stylized way in order to create the ship. So the Malay version of Islam, like Java, was very tolerant, mainly because of the position of the rulers and the cross-fertilization between the rulers and the ordinary people. Now, the rulers were very important in Islam, in the Malay world. They were considered to be the protectors of Islam. And even when the British came in and took over the area, made the Malay world, or Malaysia, into a British colony, they retained the rulers as the protectors of Islam. And so they never abandoned their position as the protectors of Islam. And they continued this role even after independence. And if you look at what is happening today, there is a resurgence of the power of the rulers. They call it the rise of the new monarchy. And as a result, they've been able then to retain older versions of Islam, to reject some of the more modernist or particularly the more Salafi, the more radical elements of Islam coming from the Middle East and also from India. Now, here, I just wanted to give you a sense of the practices in Islam before I close by looking at the education. In Southeast Asia, you can see the Islam, which is very different. You can go elsewhere in the Islamic world and you find that this kind of thing doesn't happen. For example, what you have here, you can see, this is called Slamatan, when they have a feast whenever there's a special occasion. And here you see the mountain of rice. And this is called the Tumpeng in Japanese, and this is considered to be the sacred mountain where the ancestral spirits reside. And so here, while this is for an Islamic occasion, the traditional ideas are retained because Slamatans are very important in Japanese culture. And this is retained in the mountain of rice that you have here, the Tumpeng. So you have Slamatan feast with the Tumpeng. And we look at mosques. Of course, you get a very old mosque, which are very different from the bulbous onion domes that you find in the Middle East. And if you look at, so they've adopted it now. This is a very recent one called the Blue Mosque. But this is the National Mosque in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Very, very interesting architecture. They tend to do things which they consider to be beautiful and yet Muslim. So they don't just slavishly borrow from the Middle East. And if you look at these as well, this is very interesting because Southeast Asia is known for the very strong position of women. And Barbara will be talking later on about Cambodian women. But all of Southeast Asia is known for the powerful role of women in society. And you can see that even in Islam. Here you have Islamic reading competition, which is very popular among the Malays, and the best readers are women. And here they're kind of doing this, and you see them weaving back and forth. Once I asked them, what are they doing? They say, well, they're imitating the movement of the camels. That's reading the Quran. I don't know whether that's what he said. And you have now an Islamic themed park. It's like Disneyland for the Muslims. So you go there, and what you have is these miniature mosques. You can go in there and so forth. And they represent different important mosques around the world. So they've created a theme park based on Islamic architecture. And here is something that is very interesting and new. It is a reality television in Malaysia called Soleha, which is called Pious Woman. And it is a contest to choose the best female preacher. Whereas, you can't imagine this happening in Afghanistan or places in Pakistan, for example. But here again, you show the power of women. And you look at also the kind of dress that you have in Southeast Asia. Now this type of burqa is rarely ever seen in Southeast Asia. Instead, what you find is these very colorful, beautiful types of dress. They use batik designs, and they have a headdress. And the men wear the sarongs with this type of Indonesian type dress, so that they have their own fashion, their own way. And they find it very strange that women would dress like that. Because if you go to Malaysia, you find a lot of Middle Eastern tourists. And the Malays themselves say, why are the women all in burqa, in black? And the men are walking around with Bermuda shorts and t-shirts. And so they themselves can't understand this. And they feel so sorry for their women counterparts in Islam in the Middle East. So now, to end, I'm talking about the historicizing of the whole debate. So people have talked about all of these ideas coming from the outside and being adapted. Nevertheless, one has to reject the idea that some people have said of the invasion of ideas. They have a term, Ghazw Fitri, with this idea of these invasion of ideas overwhelming the people. But this never happened in Southeast Asia because of the localization process. And moderation has been part of the Islamization process, but it is strengthened by education. And so one of the things that one called it the religious engineering, that you say, if you look at the Islamic education system, in Indonesia, for example, is one of the few places that you have this religious engineering anywhere in the world. And so what you have is the private Islamic institutions working together with the state institutions to develop curriculum, the curriculum for the schools. And in the schools then they introduce Islamic learning alongside secular learning, because many of the Muslim parents, both in Malaysia and Indonesia, say that they want to be able to have their children be able to compete in the modern world, but they want them to also be good Muslims. And so the curriculum deals with that. And in Indonesia, since 2003, all students have to enroll in a basic civics course, which involve a study of democracy, civil society, and human rights, including women's rights. Now that is pretty advanced. And this is what is happening in Malaysia, and it is also happening in Malaysia. Because even though Islam is the official religion in Malaysia, it allows the promotion of other religions. And so Islam has always been in education. But what they have done, similarly as Indonesia, is to introduce secular education alongside Muslim education. So even though they began with private Muslim schools, these schools have lost patronage mainly because the parents all want the kids to be able to compete in the modern world. So these, the curriculum in these schools have also been transformed, blending the Islamic ideas, Islamic education with Western training. And so all of these areas also have Islamic courses, Islamic institutes, all over the country. Nevertheless, this does not create a radical Islamic movement. Instead, it promotes a much more moderate form of Islam. So both Malaysia and Indonesia have what is called Masyarakat Madani, which in Indonesian or Malay is called civil society. And so they push Islam and say what we're doing is bringing about a Islamic civil society. And so it is this successful integration of these that are continuing to be an important reason for the promotion of modern Islam. And the governments are the ones at the forefront. So just to conclude then, what I tried to show you was that that to understand Southeast Asian Islam, you've got to know the difference between the majority countries and the minority ones. Because the minority Muslim countries, the people are fighting to retain their Islamic identity and their ethnic identity. And therefore, there's a lot more attempt to counter the majority country. And so you do have violence in southern Philippines and in southern Thailand. Whereas in the two main majority countries, they push for a much more moderate form of Islam because they now control the country. They control everything, and they control the whole education system. And it is this very proactive movement of the governments that have enabled modern Islam to survive. So we just came back from a conference at an Islamic university in Jakarta about 3 weeks ago. And it's really interesting to see these scholars talking about Islam in a very knowledgeable way. They read, speak Arabic, but they also read, speak Western languages, particularly English, and they're able then to participate in the kind of debates that occur in the Islamic world. And they are making waves in the sense they're saying, you know, the things that are happening, the radical elements that are happening, are not part of us. And Islam is not that kind of Islam. And that Islam is not monolithic, there is a choice. And we have decided on this modern choice, and we want people to look and see how successful we are and hope that they will also follow in our footsteps. So I'll end it there and leave it open to any questions that you might have.